Megan, I don't have you in the frame.
I'm not in.
So let me.
I'm Kim. We were really good friends a while ago.
We were?
It has lapsed somewhat because we haven't seen each other.
I know, I haven't seen you in a long
Okay.
This one.
Oh, this
So
is
you're a
me.
wise
This
ass.
is me.
Okay, we can play.
Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Megan Wilson. I am the co-director of Clarion Alley Mural Project, and welcome to our second panel today. This one is focusing on tribal nations and the relationship between tribal nations and the United States federal government. And I am going to turn this over to Mary Jean Robertson, who has been the host of Voices of the Native Nation for the past 50 years, and is celebrating it this year. Yes, this year. Woo-hoo.
Thank you, Megan. Clarion Alley, Minnesota Street Project, ATA, and all of the folks that have worked so hard for almost 3 years to put all of this stuff together. It's really exciting that it's come to such a fruition. And before you leave this building, I hope you go upstairs and see the poetry, to check out all the artwork all around. The Manifest Differently project is really exciting. So I want to thank everybody that's participated in it and worked so hard to bring it together. I also wanted to say hi to Barbara, who did the panel before this, and say that it was a very interesting panel. She had two sociologists, and they had very pro kind of stuff where they had maps and all kinds of stuff on the thing. And I don't have that. So what I do have is a bunch of friends up here. So I wanted to introduce my cousin here, Kim Shuck. And she also happened to be a poet laureate of San Francisco Emeritus, but you know, we don't talk about that much because it caused her to work much too hard and much too long, and I didn't get to see her very often. So, you know, it gets really discouraging, but you know, we do every once in a while manage to gather around the kitchen table. And it was Joy Harjo that said that that's where all the activism starts, is at the kitchen table. So I wanted to introduce Kim Shuck, and I wanted to get you guys to introduce yourselves because I didn't write it all down.
What they had for the other panel was a group of academics, and I believe we only have one of those sitting at the table at this time. I used to be an academic, but I have escaped and gone feral.
She's a recovering academic.
I'm a recovering academic. It doesn't work real well, but that's me. And I was one of the co-parents of this project, the Manifest Differently project. Some of you will be recognizing that I am not, in fact, Azocar. There are a few clues. But that became impossible, so Mary Jean, in an incredibly traditional maneuver, hinted very broadly that she would like me to do this today, and then brought me a bag full of beads. So I got beads. And so I'm here, and I probably have some things to add, because I did used to teach the class that included tribal sovereignty at San Francisco State. So before my escape, I had some training in the subject.
Thank you, Kim and Mary Jean. Kim and I went to San Francisco State together. As she said before, we were gray.
Yeah, I'm not sure you can tell because my hat's covering a lot of it.
And we probably met in one of Barney Hunter's classes.
That had to be.
So I'm now a professor at San Francisco State. I'm in the journalism department. I'm also teaching a class in American Indian Studies, which Kim is going to come and speak in my class on Wednesday. And I'm a citizen of the Upper Mattaponi tribe. I just met a random relative, Mattaponi relative. We're in what is now called the state of Virginia, and we've never been removed. We've always been there. I chose to move I chose to be in San Francisco. So it was my choice to be in San Francisco. And I am happy that my son Armand is here with me and my partner Ed to learn about sovereignty, because they don't know enough about sovereignty yet. So thanks to everybody for coming.
Hi, my name is Brian Oney, and I want to take you back to a point where you might not have had agency, and that's the point of your birth. And I want you to think about that first heartbeat that you had out in this world, and how you didn't have a choice in where you went and how you lived and the things ahead of you. And those early moments in my life led me to a family that loved me, but that did not share a history, a culture that was inherent in so-called blood. And so I was adopted, and without choice, without any say, based on the law at the time in 1970. So I wasn't taken into a Native family even though I had a Native background. And for 30 plus years, I didn't know who my birth mom was. And then I got a random call from a TV studio that asked me if I wanted to be a part of a reality show, and if I could meet my birth mom. And so this weird thing happened, and I got to meet my birth mom. And I found out that I was part Cherokee. And since then, I've been learning more and more about this culture that I come from, and it's been shaping what I think about things and how we're a part of something a lot bigger than is easy to understand when you just look out at life. So, thank you for inviting me.
By the way, Brian's my son. I gave birth to him. So, what I wanted to talk about a little bit is not necessarily totally the federal recognition process, but the fact that from my entry into San Francisco, I worked to get a transformative event in the whole country. And I helped with supporting the people that were occupying Alcatraz. And out of Alcatraz came a transformation that changed termination into self-determination. And it created a way that our nations could once again reinstitute our original governments again. And so in 1975, my nation, the Cherokee Nation, had a new constitution that was then approved, and we were able to rebuild our council, our principal chief, our legal agencies. We had a Supreme Court and all of those things. So it enabled us to be a nation again. Whereas before we basically had been terminated when Oklahoma became a state, and we were only represented by W.W. Keeler on an appointed basis for him to sign oil leases or whatever. So what I think is really important is that as nations, we have sovereignty when we take sovereignty. We have agency when we take agency. And what I hope to hear on this panel is how that manifests itself as a way through what has been imposed on us without our consent. So I'm going to go to my friend next door, and let her talk a little bit about her idea of sovereignty.
Native tribal entities are considered domestic dependent nations in this country, which is a concept that really started, is it 1821 or 1831? I think it's 1831, involving specifically the Cherokee Nation was where this whole thing started. And the goal was to empty Georgia and the Carolinas because there's gold, Georgia primarily. And so generally up until that point, there's either a war between essentially two European entities who then, one of them cedes land that's not theirs to the other one. And that's how a lot of the original land base is developed in the United States, right? Or you find somebody that you can either bribe, mislead, or bully into signing some kind of thing to give up rights to land. Okay. So what is Georgia gonna do? They want these Cherokees out of here. How do you get rid of them? Well, there was a court case. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And then we won. Supreme Court said, you don't have to go. And then Andrew Jackson said, I have the army and they're going. And so we were force marched across the country in a couple of different rounds to Oklahoma, which became Indian Territory, which is where my great-grandmother was born, and is where, that is the woman who I spent a lot of time with as a small child. So this isn't a huge amount of time we're talking about. This is a very short period of time. For me, tribal sovereignty is the ability to defend your land base, your population, and your way of life. And for some years now, that has not been a possibility for most. Thank you. There's going to be like a line in my vision if I glare out at you with not looking like I'm focusing. That is correct. For most Native tribes, bands, nations, for a long time it's not been possible to do that. But we're making some headway. And it's a conversation now. And my great-grandmother's grandfather was the head of the Cherokee Supreme Court in the 1800s. And he wasn't the last head of the Cherokee Supreme Court, but he was close to it. And then suddenly statehood, and we can't govern ourselves. I think sovereignty makes sense to people, that that's self-governance, yeah, makes sense, right? But you'll hear it has impact, and it's continued to have impact. If you've heard anything about murdered and missing Indigenous, I'm going to say people here because I don't want to have that argument, but it's often women. But the murdered and missing Indigenous people stuff that's happening, where we're a group of people who get murdered and kidnapped a lot. And you'll hear about, I think it's a bit misleading, but it's not completely untrue. You'll hear about the fact that tribal entities cannot prosecute people who come onto tribal lands and commit crimes like that. And it's a patchwork. Nothing applies nothing applies entirely to every tribal entity, so it's complicated, which makes it slightly baffling to talk about, so bear with me. But it is also true that that's the case in many places. And so people go on to tribal lands, and if the county that space is in doesn't press charges can't be pressed. But things are changing. So you might have heard, I think it was a couple of years ago in Oklahoma, there was a big case trying to get agency over that prosecution. And it got won, it got kind of rolled back, it went to various courts, things happened. I'm not entirely sure where we're at right now, but what it did do was it reestablished the identity of certain areas of Oklahoma as tribal lands, as reservation lands, which had kind of lapsed. So when I was going to school, you'd say, well, you know, my grandmother's from the reservation, and people would go, there are no reservations in Oklahoma, which was also not true because there are at least two, but again, it's complicated, right? Because each individual tribal entity ended up being a separate set of laws. Some of them are similar, some of them are not, and it gets pretty granular. I even lost myself there. How are we doing? Are we keeping up? Okay, good. I'm glad at least that much. The current governor of Oklahoma is pretty much not in favor of a lot of agency for the tribes, because if you look at Oklahoma and you see how much space that takes up, that really undermines his personal power. So these things are never really about what's the right thing. It's always about somebody's agenda. That's always the case. He's got a pretty conservative concept of how things should go. I was really proud not that long ago when laws against women's agency over their own health care passed, and 4 women from the Tahlequah Hospital said, you know what? They can make any law they want. I'm Cherokee and I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing. And I was like, yes. And I will start gathering bail money for you because these people are going to go after you. So essentially, there's an illusion of sovereignty. We can have what we claw back, and nobody's going to hand it to us. It's going to require some pretty serious arguing. That's where we're at. That's what you wanted me to say, right? Yeah. We didn't talk about it.
So, I've been a journalist for 50 years. And this lady who is sitting next to Kim is an academic journalist. And she was also head of the Native American Journalists Association, I believe is now called the Indigenous Journalists Association. And one of the things that happens is that we can exercise agency through our press as well. So the Cherokee Nation had a group of journalists that started the first Native American press called the Cherokee Phoenix. Elijah Bubna was the first editor, I believe, and they were trying to do public relations to make sure that everybody knew that the Cherokees weren't savages and they weren't, they were the kind of people that you could live with next door and not really be murdered in your beds or whatever. So they were telling people in Cherokee and in English and lobbying for the Cherokee Nation to remain in Georgia. So then once they got removed, they changed the name from the Phoenix to the Advocate, and they said, forget it, we're not going for public relations anymore. We want to advocate for whatever it is that we need as Native people. And it was followed quite soon afterwards by the Choctaw and the Chickasaw advocates. So,
I have a question.
Yeah.
What was Cherokee literacy at that time? You know?
Oh yeah, we had just gotten our syllabary out there, and the amazing part was not that Sequoia had created a whole syllabary. The amazing part was after the syllabary was created, 98% of the Cherokee people were literate in Cherokee. That's amazing. It's a higher literacy rate than we probably have right now in the nation. But I just wanted to say, Christina, thank you for joining us today, and you have written this marvelous book about media and the and how is, you know, oftentimes yellow journalism has affected us negatively. So we want to try and control the narrative about what actually goes on to create our own agency and our own sovereignty. Can you tell us a little bit about how it's worked both ways?
Right, so thank you. So the idea of federal recognition came into the venue of the Upper Mattaponi tribe in 1974 when our relatives petitioned the government to become federally recognized. So in the state of Virginia, there were no federally recognized tribes. There were only state recognized tribes. And what happens when you're federally recognized is you have the ability, you don't get the ability, you have the ability to provide for your people, basically. You have education, you have healthcare, you have things that make it easier to maintain your culture. And so that is really the point of federal recognition. It's not about casinos. But what I was wondering when my tribe was going through this is how much the press was conflating this idea of getting a casino with the idea of federal recognition. And so I started doing this research thinking like, okay, well, what is in the news about federal recognition? What research has been done? And I found nothing. I found a few legal papers. I found some sort of tangential ideas, but so I decided that I was going to write this book because at the same time my tribe was going through the federal recognition process. And my uncle Kenny was chief of the tribe at the time. And so in terms of controlling the narrative, what this meant was I asked him, I interviewed him for the book, and I said, so what was your relationship with the news media when you were going through this? And he said he learned that in order to get the agenda of the tribe through is that he had to be the one to set up the press conferences. He had to control the narrative. He had to make friends with the media so that it all came from his perspective and not the perspective of the Virginia government. Which I always find is ironic, sort of at the end of the process when the federal recognition happened in 2018 was none other than our own favorite President Trump signed it. And which is a big surprise. So it would have gone through, if he had waited a half an hour, it would have gone through on its own, but I think he just wanted to have his stamp on the forehead of some tribes. But in the process of doing this book, I decided to look at all of the coverage of federal recognition that I could find. So I went to the database at San Francisco State, and I went back 40 years. And in the 40 years of coverage that I looked at, there were fewer than 4,000 articles. And there were only 20 broadcast articles and this was mainstream media. So this is radio, TV, and there wasn't anything, really. So if you think that the people in the US reading, paying attention to media, pre-internet, was that nobody saw anything about federal recognition, and so nobody knew what it was until after 1987 when the Cabazon decision came out that enabled tribes to have gaming operations. And that's when federal recognition became contentious. Before then, it wasn't contentious. It was only when tribes might actually have the ability to have an economic presence in their own people's lives, but then potentially take away an economic avenue for non-Indian people is when federal recognition actually got controversial. And so what my book does is it really delves into how many stories before Cabazon say anything about casinos, how many say anything about casinos after, And how many of these stories actually mention terms that have to do with sovereignty? And it's very, very uneven, right? Because how many of you know what federal recognition is? Like, how many of you ever learned about federal recognition in elementary school or college? Like, it's not a term that most people know anything about, and so why should journalists know this term? And journalists who have this structural formula for going about doing stories, it's quick, you're on a deadline, you don't necessarily have time to talk to people, you talk to the same people over and over. And so journalists just ignored the idea of sovereignty in coverage of federal recognition, and they glommed onto the controversy, which is what journalists do, and they only talk about casinos. And therefore it turns the public against this idea of federal recognition, because it's not framed in this way of giving Native people the economic power to govern ourselves and control healthcare and control education and make sure that our people get what they need to be healthy. Instead, it's about, well, what are these people going to get over what we don't have, and how is that going to impact our economic prosperity if Indians get it and nobody else gets it, right? And so then it's a special privilege. Well, how come they get it and they can't get it? So what it does, it just pits groups of people against each other. So what's interesting was when my tribe got federal recognition in 2018, one of the first things we did was we opened a healthcare center. And the healthcare center is open to anybody in the community. Like, you don't have to be Native. We're using government funds in order to help all the people in the community. And if you look at what's happened across Indian country when tribes get federally recognized, that's what happens. So in California, there's 574 federally recognized tribes across the country, 110 of them are in California. And if you look at the tribes in California that people have been very against getting federal recognition because of this idea of casinos, if you go back to the communities after the tribes got federal recognition, you'll say, well, what happened? Were all your fears manifested, right? Well, no, because it turns out when the tribe got federal recognition, they actually were able to bring police, fire, and healthcare into the communities that they didn't have before in these rural communities. And so all of those fears didn't come to fruition. What happened was the whole community ended up thriving because of the economic base that tribes were able to bring to the communities. But unfortunately, those types of stories aren't the types that are told in the media, because that's not the way that the media works. And so now I have an alert for federal recognition, a Google alert. So like every day I get an alert about federal recognition, and it's still all about controversy, right? It's not about what's going to happen economically to a whole community if tribes are allowed to have their own economic existence. And even if you just think about for my own tribe in terms of this agency and how we are manifesting differently, since that is our theme, is I was able to be on our Constitution Committee. So after we got federal recognition, the tribe said, we're going to have an entirely new Constitution. And so the committee that I was on, we decided to completely throw out our old Constitution and start anew without using these sort of colonial terms, which was fascinating. I mean, I learned probably as much in that process as I did writing this book, but things like, how do we ensure that our tribal members have the strongest voice, and we don't allow, like in our tribes, there's like two main families. So how do we keep them from being having power struggles between families? And given the chance to govern ourselves, we can get past all of that stuff that had been handed to us, because tribes before, at some point in 2015, this is like kind of getting in the weeds, in 2015, the way that federal recognition happened changed with the government. And there was a certain formula that tribes had to have when making their constitutions that had to conform with what the US government said we had to do. But then that practice ended, and so we got to say how we were going to do it. And so even though a lot of the language might sound like sort of a constitution as we all might know it from American government, it's done in a way that benefits us and make sure that the people are at the forefront. And the government has been saying, like, Native people can't do that for themselves, right? We've always been sort of this thought of as children, and so we have to have this paternalistic idea that we have to be able to tell them what to do in order for them to be able to govern themselves. And unfortunately for the federal government, one of the things I think that they're finding is that it gives us too much power.
The real objection.
The real objection. So I will stop there. Well, it's longer than I thought it was going to be.
Can I make a little comment? Yeah.
So I, in 2004, I finished a high school level curriculum for geometry that used indigenous practices as a modality. And I had gotten, as I was developing it for the 10 years before that, I kept being invited to come speak in Native schools around the state. And I used to get invited, and they couldn't pay me, and they couldn't pay me all of the gas to get me there, and they couldn't do any of that. But what they could do is that I'd sleep on somebody's sofa, and there'd be somebody feed me something traditional, and that was great. And I was young enough to enjoy sleeping on the sofa. I couldn't do it now. And that would happen, and there'd be a bit of a feast, and people would be grateful that I was there, and there would be a party, and that was great. And the last time I got invited to do one of these things is post casino for this one tribe, and I'm not going to say who it was, but they put me up at the casino hotel and gave me vouchers and signed me up for a hot rock massage and all this. And I gotta say, I kind of liked the feast better and the sofa. That's just me. But what I want, my point was that this thing about education and putting the people first and the focus on casinos is this horrible thing. As a personal perspective, I don't like the thought that my tribe, and they do make money off of pandering to people's addictions. However, before, I could see light through holes in the walls of the schools. Okay. The roads were terrible. And sometimes there wasn't running water in the damn school for the kids, right? And now it's really gotten much better. So as far as being these, and again, these dependent children who require supervision, I think we're not doing too badly.
It's always a pleasure to go back and home and visit, and driving from one side of Oklahoma to the other, you can always tell where it's a tribal nation because the roads are much better.
They are.
It's truly amazing.
Traveling from, we went to go visit her aunt, in Fayetteville, and then drove back into Oklahoma. And you knew when you hit the border because it comes right in, that road comes right into the Cherokee Nation, and it's like,
Whoa!
True. It was.
Okay, the other person on the end down here is my son. We were reunited on a TV show that was really bizarre, and Kim can talk about it too because she was there.
Ask me that story, but not on the mic.
And one of the reasons I was looking at Julian Noiscat, who's also a journalist, he has just made a new movie called Sugarcane. And it's about the residential school that his father was born into. And one of the most powerful scenes in that movie was a scene between Julian and his father talking about the residential schools. And when you know that the major effort of the federal government to separate us from our lands and our culture is to take our children away, I wanted to tell you that when children are reunited with their biological parents, all kinds of strange things happen. You realize that maybe it's not all nurture, it could be nature. So Brian, can you share a little bit about your bewilderment and being dropped into the deep well of Cherokee culture?
Sure. And I just want to make sure that I'm talking to the right people because I want to be vulnerable here. And that has everybody here felt a little uncomfortable at some point in their life, like they felt like they didn't belong, or they felt like an outsider, or they were part of a greater culture that just didn't make sense, some sort of inner resistance, like it just, okay, all right, good. I'm in the right place. So one of the things that the parents that adopted me did right is they let me know that I was adopted before I had memory, right? So they must have told me many times. And so one thing, before I get into the learning Cherokee, which is kind of cool, I want to talk a little bit about identity. And by knowing that I wasn't the same definition as a kid as my youngest brother who was born, it just created a little bit of a divergence. And as I grew up, I kept seeing more and more of this divergence. And maybe this is my Cherokee background, but I became a little bit of a rebel. I didn't see how this all worked. And the cool thing about this idea of adoption, is that I flipped it over and I realized that not only was I adopted, but I could adopt. So if any of you, I hope that everything you attend can give you some microcosm of enlightenment or a better perspective to allow you more prosperity and enjoyment in life. And maybe this is one of those insights, is that if you don't feel like your parents gave you everything you needed, well, adopt some new ones. Adopt a new idea. Adopt a new way of living. Or if you feel that people around you are depressed and not positive, adopt some new friends. So, flip that coin and find people that inspire you and surround yourself with them and make them a part of your life. And, family doesn't have to be what other people say it is. It can be exactly what you choose to make it. So, I'm gonna fast forward from the bizarre meeting event. Again, if you want more, ask him off the mic, because it'll be more fun and probably, maybe more words that aren't appropriate for radio. So it was like shell shock, realizing that I was a part of something that was much bigger and quite profound, and I knew that I was in very deep waters, and I felt like I didn't have any kind of tools to navigate. And so I kind of went back to my safe place. I went back home and I was focused on family and things like that. And I don't know, what was it? 6 years ago, 7, maybe 10 years ago, I lost a business. I lost a marriage that I thought was working well, and then the next day I realized it wasn't. So big changes in my life. And I went to LA and started just working my way up again, because I'd lost so much. And a couple years ago, I got this, we were talking because we'd stayed in contact, and she said, hey, one of my roommates is going into a care facility and we have a room opening up. And I said, well, I'm kind of tired of this place. You mind if I come up? And so I moved in, and I'm single now, so it's an awesome green flag for me, but probably a red flag for any woman who thinks I'm attractive. I moved in with my mom, but it's been one of the best experiences of my life, because not only have I gotten a crash course in Native American history, specifically Cherokee history, but MJ is a part of a different kind of culture in San Francisco. She's kind of the old school, where she's a part of the people that were artists with a different kind of mindset and making things happen. And the unique thing about MJ is that she surrounds herself with people that have a positive facing vision. There are lots of groups that are really frustrated, kind of leftovers from the 60s that are still angry and caught up in that anger, and that's their identity is I'm an angry person and I wish things were different. I just want everything to end. But she's looking for the people that are looking for things to begin, to nurture, to grow, to expand the good. And as I was listening to both of you, I was hearing that element as well. And that there's something that we can do to grow, to contribute to add value to in our lives, and just by sharing information, perspectives, and things like that. And so MJ and I have read a lot of the same books, and there's pretty esoteric things. We eat similar things, we have similar patterns, we organize in similar ways. And so I just want to say that, in this whole, rubric of, that nurture is really important, which I used to believe, like I was a staunch believer that, that how you nurture your children is going to have more of an effect than the genetics. And having lived with my mom for, over a year now, I don't believe that as strongly. So there is something to be said for genetics. So I am a big believer that children should be raised by at least the culture that their parents are from, because there may be something in that makes a difference. So if there are parents willing to adopt people of that culture, I think that should be critical. And the last little nuance here is that when you're talking about sovereignty, you're talking about power. And the thing that I've been wrestling with is, you said, healthcare got better, which is awesome. And I think that if you're looking for a vision, I would take a quick look at how does your vision include economics? How can you make people's lives better, both economically and in other ways? Because when you talk about power, there's an element of economics there. When you have more economics, you have more power. They're just linked up. And so I don't know if you can trust groups of bigger than 500 people, but I'd say get together and talk to your friends about how you can improve your economics together. How can you make you and your friends, your neighbors, whoever that you care about, how can you get together? And I mean, it can be as simple as a Costco run or sharing a breakfast, because the cool thing that underlies economics is human connection. And I think that's a bigger value than the finances of it all, is if you can find people that you can have meaningful conversations with, like I've discovered with my mom, then your life gets better. And the economics don't matter as much. But I think if we're going to get together as a group, if we can find ways to improve our collective economics, it might be a good thing. I'm not talking socialism, I'm just talking among friends, how can we create a little economic advantage? So, did I answer your question? Or at least start at it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I just really wanted to talk a little bit about how amazing it is to support one another. When I quoted from Joy Harjo about the kitchen table is where activism starts, I was at a kitchen table where a group of women got together and we were laughing and giggling and having a really good time. And it turned into an organization called Women of All Red Nations. There was another time when we went up to Yelm, Washington, and we gathered together as women, and Yetzi Blue, Janet McLeod, was running a group of 500 women, and we were just up there talking about the issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the early days, talking about all kinds of things that were affecting women. And Janet has one of the loudest voices I have ever heard. And she uses her voice to make sure that all the warriors are there to honor and protect and defend the women and children. And I've been so lucky in my life to be able to interview and meet so many strong women, Mary and Carrie Dan in the Western Shoshone Nation. And they almost got arrested by the Bureau of Land Management for trespassing on their own land. The Treaty of Ruby Valley does not give up a single acre of land, and yet they were trying to say that the Western Shoshone people were trespassing on their own land. And they tried to take their livestock away from them because, oh, you're doing away with the prairie that should be here. We need to lower the numbers of your livestock. Everybody tries to control everything, and it's usually the women that are fighting back. And I have been really lucky to have met so many strong women. Wilma Mankiller is the first woman chief in the modern era. There were lots of women chiefs way beyond, back before. But she was an inspiration to me. She was also part of Alcatraz. She was also one of the founders of the California Indian Legal Services. And she learned here in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, multicultural activism, working with groups that are not like you in order to accomplish goals.
She lived right up the hill.
Yes.
Just like right up the hill.
Yeah, she lived right over there. So, anyway. She
Went
lived,
to SF State.
yeah, she did go to SF State.
Everybody went to SF State.
And
How about Roberta Minigood?
yeah, Roberta Blackgold.
Black.
Yeah, Roberta Blackgold. Dene Nation, part of the Big Mountain support. And I have to say that in the 1970s, my roommate Tavia and I were asked by the American Indian movement of the local area to be the representatives to a couple of different organizations. And one of them was the Native American Solidarity Committee. So we were like the advisors to the Native American Solidarity Committee. And one day, one of the people said, well, you guys haven't brought coffee yet. I said, well, I don't think you understand the role that Tavia and I play in this organization. We are not members of your group. We are advisors to your group. So, we don't bring the coffee.
I advise you order coffee.
If you want it, you bring it. But I'm really grateful that all three of you are here. And I'm very sorry that we were unable to arrange things so that Rose Aguilar could be here as well. She was away, traveling, and she asked if we could do it on Zoom. And by the time I got back to her saying, yes, we could possibly do it on Zoom, she said, well, I've already made arrangements to be somewhere else at that time. So unfortunately, we're going to have to get her onto the radio show so that we can interview her about these issues, because she is an amazing journalist at KALW, and she's so wide-ranging, and I feel so grateful that we have a Native woman who is on a major radio station in a major media center talking about all kinds of issues, because she talks about it from an Indigenous women's perspective. And it is so important, like you were saying, about having the Native voice rather than having people just look at short bites of information and short conflict but to have a person who is imbued in her own California Indian culture and still able to talk about international issues in such a powerful way. So journalism rocks. I love it.
That's fair. To bring it back to that part of sovereignty is the ability to protect and nurture our children. I speak to young people a lot. Some of them are children, some of them are just younger than me, and as time goes on, that becomes a bigger number. But I find myself in these bizarre circumstances where, well, first of all, my dad, the Cherokee one in my family, was a telecommunications engineer. And when I was doing math in a previous life, people would always go, isn't that an odd thing for Native people to do? And I'm like, I totally got that from my dad's side of the family. It's a weird assumption to make, but it comes with the truncation, the stereotypification, if I can make a word up right on the spot, of indigenous people, you know. It has been said of the Cherokee that our fascination with numbers should probably long ago have attracted competent mental attention, mental medical attention. And that may be the case. My grandfather, my father's father, was a gunnery sergeant during World War II, chased Rommel around the desert, and used to do trig in his head. So this is something I definitely got from that side of the family. My mother's a little hopeless on that subject. We don't know our histories entirely, and part of our challenge is to decolonize in order to get back to a place where we can competently enact sovereignty, which is not a choice that the United States government gets to make when that starts to happen. I think we have to figure it out for ourselves. And so these things that we've been getting back gradually through a lot of effort and not a little bit of death and destruction and misery, as you might imagine. These are things we have to teach ourselves what our way of doing them is, because in some cases we have no record of it. In some cases the record is in things like art and literature, oral literature in particular. I find myself walking around the world telling young Native people in particular, you're not less than your ancestors. And having that be really profound, and it always makes me sad that that has as big an effect as it does. Because that's part of the narrative. Part of the narrative about, the why Northern Plains people had to die was because, well, at one point they were proud and noble people, but look what they've come to. It's almost a generous act to kill them off, right? I teach kids a lot, and a lot of it's just listening. I mean, I'm working with Amy here on a project right now. On the first day, I'm sitting with my 3 allotted high school students. And one of them looks at me and says, so what are you going to teach us? And I was like, you've misunderstood it. I'm not here to teach you anything. I'm here to have you teach me. We're not less than what we've come from, but we've got a lot of recovery of material to do. So you'll see, for example, I'm an artist. A lot of Cherokee artists right now are going back to mound builder culture and biting off of those images in order to move forward. To find a throughway that doesn't need to, find a throughway for our art that doesn't have to borrow from, Leonardo, as great as he was. So that we have our own materials, we just have to do some work recovering them. And I have to say I'm not a little bit resentful about the fact that we have to do that. But it's also a privilege to be able to be part of it. And decolonization is a big pain in the butt, because what's this panel called? What do we call the panel? Megan, what do we call the panel?
Sovereignty.
Whose sovereignty? Just sovereignty? Good. Because the words we've been using are indigenous, which implies there's something other than indigenous, or native, which also assumes a colonial power, or American Indian, which isn't us, but has been used and is the legal term. We're calling ourselves Cherokee. Our name for ourselves is Oney. Decolonizing is really difficult because on some level, language has to be communicative and we need to be understood to one another. But in many cases, the people who lose in that understanding, the people who have to bend for that, are some of us and not all of us. And so, I mean, it's just such a process, right? And it's really hard to unpack, and it is confusing, and it is ongoing. And I think my personal difficulties maybe in conveying some of what I'm trying to say is that it is that complicated. It's a great book by Linda D.Y. Smith called Decolonizing Methodologies that I cannot recommend enough. Just an ad for somebody else's book. But, this ability to give our kids the things they need, to give them things that make sense in their heart, and make sense in their sinews, it's a big deal. And it's a really important part of this.
Thank you, Kim. Christina, can you talk a little bit more about sovereignty?
Yes. First, I just want to go to Kim, because this idea of decolonization is, and I interview, and I have a quote from Linda in my book, and hopefully I'm going to interview her this year for another project I'm doing called Decolonizing Media Research. And it's very hard, it's a hard thing to do, so I don't know how successful I am, but we will have to go to Australia and New Zealand to do this, so I'm sure we'll at least have some success there. So I teach a class called American Indian Image and Issues, and because I've come from sort of the journalistic field, what I told them, I said, we're not going to look at anything that other people have done about us. We're only going to look at things that we have done about ourselves. And that's in the effort of decolonization, is also not to compare. So I'm working on another book called Indigenous Peoples in the Media. It's an edited book, and the co-author was the editor of the first edition, along with John Sanchez, who's an Apache professor at University of Pennsylvania, Penn State University. And she said, well, this piece compares this. And I said, we're not going to compare in this book. I'm not going to be a part of a book that compares. Like, all of our authors are going to be Indigenous people just talking about our perspective of this, who have made media. The comparisons that can happen are only for Indigenous people working with a non-Indigenous researcher that and they're allowing that perspective, and they're learning, and the non-Indigenous person is learning from the Indigenous people about why something might be inappropriate or why we can't talk about it. And so I appreciate that you said that, because I think that it is really hard to do, right? It's hard not to compare, because in our heads we have images of what Indians are supposed to look like. And I don't think any of us, because of how inculcated it is, since we were born, and even our own people have ideas about what they should be, and we see that sometimes manifested in things like the use of blood quantum, which is a hugely problematic.
And now you've opened up a can of worms.
Sorry, that's right, we are on the radio. And I'll just say quickly that blood quantum was a way that the federal government decided to categorize Indians in order to have fewer and fewer Indians as time went by. But it still didn't work. It was just one of the many things that the U.S. government did that never worked. So, I forgot what the actual question was. I was just talking more about sovereignty. I'm talking more about sovereignty. So what else can I say about sovereignty other than it is I think it's thought of differently depending on where a tribe is in the process. So and how big and how many layers of government. So one of the people, actually it's really funny because I interview Patty Talahamba, who's a Hopi journalist, and I said, so what's the hardest thing for journalists to understand about sovereignty and federal recognition? And she said, the layers. Just the many, many layers, because tribal governments also look very different depending on the tribal government. So the Upper Mattapanai, we are 500-ish people, 500 to 600, and we have never really left our land base, so we've always been there. And so our seat is easier to visualize because most people are around the same area. But if you go then to Patty explained to me in terms of Hopis is each village is its own entity that is then part of a bigger entity. Mm-hmm. And so the way things are done with the Hopis is not going to work for the Upper Mattapanais, just like the way things are done in Peru may not work in Belize, right? So, and I think that people have this understanding of Native people as these sort of everybody's kind of the same, but it is very different. And so the sovereignty between tribes and among tribes looks different, and the relationships with the governments look different. And one of the in the process of writing this book, what I also remembered was this scene that happened that played out when I was probably about 22 years old. My uncle was the chief of the tribe, and he had told me to come. I was in DC, and so he said, come to this meeting of the Indian Affairs with me, and John McCain was the head of Indian Affairs at the time. And so this was one of the, I don't know how many years in the federal recognition process it was, but John McCain asked my uncle this question. He said, so if you get federal recognition, are you going to have a casino? And I remember my uncle just kind of his jaw dropped. And then I thought, well, why wasn't he expecting that question? And he said, well, we're Baptist. So it doesn't fit into our goal of what we want for our people, because we are Southern Baptist, right? This is Virginia, we are Southern Baptist. So even that, the religious aspect that plays into sovereignty and what each tribe is going to try to get to be able to use as part of the sovereignty for its people is going to change based on religion, based on we had our first encounter in 1600, right? So California wasn't until much, much later, and so what is lost is so much different on the East Coast than it is on the West Coast, and what that historical memory is so much different here than it is on the East Coast. So it's this idea of not being able to compare sovereignties, but respect each tribal entity as its own, having its own discussion. And one of the most important things that I remember about somebody else articulating something that I could never do, which is why I interviewed a lot of people for this book, is Brian Pollard, who was the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix for a long time. He's at the AP, and he said, I think that the thing that people don't understand is that Native nations are not racial entities. Mm-hmm. We are political entities. We are a political party that has a relationship with the government, and each tribe is a political entity that has a different relationship with the government, and people just don't understand that. And so people think of us as just another racial group. We have your blacks, and you have your Indians, and you have your Asians, and you have your Latinos, which aren't a racial group. But so it's a very different relationship with the government. And so also when we're talking about, in terms of sovereignty, when we're talking about rights, like Native people have different rights because of that sovereignty than other ethnic and racial groups do in the United States. This was ours, right? This was ours. It was not, nobody was, we weren't brought here, something wasn't imposed upon us. And so we have certain inherent knowledge also of what is important to us that other racial groups might not have, because we're a political group, we're not a racial group. And so sovereignty is a relationship with a political group and not a relationship with a racial group.
Yeah, I have. I was doing a poetry reading down at the Autry. This woman came up to me afterwards and said, the first thing she said was, "Are you really Cherokee?" And I don't ever really know how to respond to that. I'm like, no, you're right, you got me. The fact is, I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation.
100% Cherokee citizen.
So that's complicated because of sovereignty. But also, she then said to me, because you don't look Indian to me, I'm a third Cherokee. Now, thank you. That was the number that came up for me too. I was like, hang on. I understand you're trying to yell at me, but I'm curious about this third thing because I'm thinking about how many generations your family would have to be here to be a third, and I'm just not getting there. So that's like,
Because the math isn't working.
because the math's not working. 2, 4, 8, 16. When do we get to a third? You could get close, but you can't. And it sounds like I'm being a pedant, but that absolutely was what went through my head. And then she said, "Are you on the rolls?" Now, that's an interesting question too, because the Cherokee rolls were done at the turn of the 20th century. And I look younger than I am, but I'm not that old. It's like I need to write a very stern letter to my face frame company if you think I was born early enough for that to be a thing. Also, there are tribes that don't view Cherokees as Indians because of our specific rules about tribal citizenship. Because people do it differently. Some tribes, it's blood quantum. I just have to say, I think that's an incredibly bad idea because it does give you an expiry date. But it's not up to me to decide that for any other tribe, so you do you, you know? Some people do it by, our tribe does it by the presence of direct lineage from somebody on the rolls, which again is it's governmental approval, which is kind of like having the executioner tell you you have a nice neck. It's a little problematic. Some tribes are all about residency, that you have to have a certain blood quantum, but also a certain residency, so you have to live in community. I understand that one, but I'm also glad my tribe doesn't have that. I was born and raised in San Francisco. And frankly, there are more Cherokees in California than there are collectively anywhere else. So, you know, people misunderstood the court case that happened pretty recently with the Cherokee about the black Cherokees. It was literally about the freedmen. So there are black Cherokees who are Cherokee by blood, who are related to somebody on the Dawes roll. And there are black Cherokees who are Cherokees because they were enslaved by a Cherokee family. That's a big conversation. I just opened a bigger can of worms. Yeah, so it's a big deal, right? And so the people who were disenfranchised by that vote, theoretically, were the freedmen. That wasn't how it was working out. So tribal membership even is a huge big deal and really complicated and goes tribe by tribe by tribe. There are a number of tribes who've been disenfranchising people because the family didn't like the other family, too. That has also happened. It's not as common as it's been reported, but it has also happened.
Well, it's controversial,
Yeah.
and that's why it gets reported,
Exactly.
right? Because when you have tribes in one casino saying that we're going to get rid of these other family members, then that also complicates the the political narrative of federal recognition. In Virginia, going back to how roles are done, so in Virginia, in the 20s, there was this guy named Walter Plucker. And Walter Plucker decided that there were no more Indians in Virginia, and so he created the Racial Integrity Act, and he wiped all Indians off the Virginia. And so he changed, based on phonology, like what you look like, he said you're either black or you're white. There are no more Indians. And that didn't get changed until the 60s. And at some points, people were having to pay to get their birth certificates changed back to Indian. You no longer have to pay if that's still the case, but part of the federal recognition process is you have to trace lineage. There has to be a paper trail for lineage back before the 1900s. But when the federal government, not just the Racial Integrity Act, but also the census played a role, and also Jim Crow played a role in making sure there weren't any Indians, then that was another method that the government made, the roadblock that it put so the tribes could not be federally recognized because they couldn't go through the process because they would fail in the process. And each place is very different, and I don't know what other tribes had to go through, I'm sure there's many racial integrity acts out there. Ours is the one that I know the best just because of the exploration of it. But one of the things that happened after 2015 is more Native people were involved in the federal recognition process. But there's an Eastern Cherokee guy who was at the head of the federal recognition process. And so the head of that tribe is against the Lumbee tribe becoming federally recognized. And so that tribe has been blocked forever in getting federal recognition. And in my book, I reached out to him multiple times and had a bunch of questions about conflicts of interest and all these things. But there was also and so it seems like, well, that's really bad, like Indians against Indians, right?
Good old lateral violence.
But the government has set up a scarcity of resources to make people pitted against each other, right? Just like in every sort of situation, when you have scarce resources, the government is able to control that by making the resources harder to get in order to pit people against each other. And so it's this kind of this perpetual cycle that we can put some practices into place, but then of course we think like, oh well, if that tribe gets that, then our tribe might not be able to get that, and then what is that going to do to our people? Part of my idea of also decolonization is for people to stop thinking of Native people as these sort of nature-loving, we're only, it's all kumbaya all the time, and remembering that we are political entities that are here to serve our people and our people's needs. And there are organizations that are sort of, pan-Indian to make sure that we all get certain things, but at the end of the day, we are very much interested in the survival of our own peoples and cultures, and sometimes that is against what other tribes need.
Yeah, the misunderstandings are really epic. One of my favorite anecdotes is being asked to do an event in San Francisco for young women, and I started to talk, and this teacher in the audience said, "Well, I'm an enrolled Cherokee, and I get my check every month." And, we were given the best land in the country. I've been to the reservation in New Mexico. Okay, so Cherokees don't get a monthly stipend. By the way, some people do, Cherokees don't. We weren't given land. This is what's left of our traditional homelands, or else, like my tribe, I'm Western Cherokee, so we got planted down in Kaw and Omaha territory and are basically occupying somebody else's land while not by free will, because that was mandated by the U.S. government, but I mean, it becomes a little awkward. I keep recommending that we acknowledge that in some kind of way, and the pushback against that has been pretty amazing. And we don't have any land in New Mexico. I mean, it's just really interesting because somebody thought they were going to drag me, ended up looking pretty stupid. Sometimes you just let them have the rope they want, go off into whatever they're going to do with it. I was frequently, because I went off to school, I was the one who went off to school. My great-grandmother was pretty well loved by a lot of people and was from a family that was pretty well loved by a lot of people, so I used to get invited to come yell at the principal chief on occasion. Like, I'd get a phone call from some older woman who'd speak to me in half Cherokee and half English and ask me to come out and yell at the government. And so I was doing that at one point when they were negotiating how they were going to prevent us hotheads from getting the situation with the Cherokee freedmen corrected. And I won't tell you which principal chief it was, but I actually ended up telling him.
Was that Joe? Was that Ross? Was that...
You actually know who it was. He still kind of hides from me. We're having an argument. And I said, look, I'll pay for it. Let's go have genetic testing done. And I'll tell you what the answer's going to be right now. We will have this done, and you and I will both find out what we already know, which is that both of us are Euro-American, Oney, and African-American. Who are you trying to disenfranchise? And one of the guys on the council said, aren't you an octoroon? I was like, I think you'll find that particular word has fallen out of favor. Factually correct, culturally questionable choice of word. I said, and what does that really mean anyway? Do you know? And he's like, I'm like, right, it kind of means I could be a free woman of color in Louisiana during the 1800s. It's kind of passed out of real use. We are not a group of people that have tons of things in common all the time. That was two Cherokees having that argument, or two and one assist from somebody who also helped with stupid. It's complicated. I sit in meetings where I'm like, how am I at all related to these people? I could be at home putting beads on leather, which is what I really want to be doing right now. But, sovereignty, unfortunately, means we have to listen to all of the stupid ideas as well as the good ones.
It's just been Kim and I talking now.
You've just had a big lesson in Cherokee culture, too. It's just been us.
So this has been my life, is listening to conversations like this and realizing how much I don't know and how much opportunity I have to learn. And I want to thank all of you for being on this journey with me, because I love these conversations. It feels, well, yeah. But here's my personal frustration, is that I feel like the game we're playing is stacked against us. There's 330 million people here in the United States, and the percentage of Cherokee is way less than, I believe, 1% of that. And so when you're talking about sovereignty and power and influence, you realize that maybe we have something in common with a lot of the culture, is that we don't feel like we have the power over our own lives.
I don't know, we are the 1%, man.
Yeah, but,
Oh, that's the other percent. I get it wrong.
So there is, it's kind of both sides of that coin, right? We're the 1% versus 1%. And, when you realize the limits on power, yet if you listen to what's happening at this table, you can feel the power. These women are powerful women, and their ideas and their hearts and their passions can change lives. They can change minds. And I think that media is repeating another 1% message over and over and over again because they have massive power, they have massive economics, they have massive influence. And so I want to acknowledge all of you for being here and listening to a different 1%. And hope that you share a little bit of this message with someone that you care about. Because I believe that all of you have influence, I believe that all of you have agency, and I want you to have even more. Because you're the kind of people that can change the world. So with that, I'm going to tap out and thank all of you for being here.
I want you to walk out of this room thinking that the thing that all Native people have in common is humor. That's my goal. I think we're doing pretty well.
So do you guys have any questions? Sovereignty is sovereign. Rita.
I just wanted to do an add-on because I know different cultures that have been colonialized, and there is, and I wrote it down, colonizing the mind. What was the name of that book again?
Is it Decolonizing the Mind?
You mean decolonizing methodologies?
Methodology.
Yes.
Oh, no, yeah, decolonizing.
Okay, so that one reminds me of Ngugi Diango. Yes, he wrote Decolonizing the Mind.
Yeah.
And he made reference to how it affects people in Africa, African Americans, and when I heard him speak, Native Americans or Indians as well. So it's, you see it happening, you know, any form of colonization, you see it, how it affects us all in ways in which we think, because English itself is non-causal, it's one-sided, it does not consist of a circle, it's one way, it's, oh, don't get me started. But it's that kind of thing. So that's what I wanted to compare the two books, because I have his book, but I hadn't heard of this one.
Linda's book is very good. Tarita McCall, one of the Bay Area's preeminent
Poets and poetry teachers and storytellers.
and then,
Yes. Thank you so much for your talk and insights.
You're welcome.
And I just had a question because my family's from Taiwan and we've had our decades of sovereignty issues
Ongoing.
Still ongoing. Yeah, exactly. And also within Taiwan, numerous tribes as well.
Yes.
And the issues around exactly the recognition by the government and what that does and the scarcity of resources and all that. And I know the U.S. is much larger, the Americas, but I've been meeting people in Taiwan involved in truth and reconciliation issues and transitional justice. And I was thinking, because they were like, what's it like in the United States for Native Americans? And I was like, I don't think there has been a truth and reconciliation. I mean, given the diversity of groups, political, ethnic, cultural, right, linguistic, right, and also because the United States is so much larger, covers, right, and Taiwan's a small little island of 23 million, but they're still going through that transitional justice, but they also need to get the historical record right. And that is the biggest issue right now. So they have all these people sitting on these panels and getting that historical record right to be able to move forward with a plan, right? And I'm wondering, is it something that's in the conversation for Native Americans? And also, what would be some of those goals? Like, knowing that there is some sovereignty, partial sovereignty, a mix of different kinds of organizing, and like when we went to Gila River, we spoke to a woman there who was telling us how layered it is and complicated.
Exactly.
That it's partial, right? Mm-hmm. But they are happy with what things are sort of working for them, right? They would have a lot of control of that area and what they want to do with the land. So, yeah, I'm just curious how yeah, where that status is or how that would work. And,
Yeah,
and I think it's so deep in the United States because, right, because we're talking about reparations now, but there's been no concerted effort to get the record straight.
Yeah, well,
Whatever.
No, that is exactly right.
one of the things was the 20-year process of the International Indian Treaty Council in Geneva to fight for the rights of indigenous people. It was not just for the indigenous people of the U.S. It was the rights of indigenous people all over the world. So Taiwan has its indigenous people. They have several tribes. And so part of our struggle was to make sure that the UN recognized the rights of indigenous peoples. We had to have a hunger strike to get the S on the end of the word peoples.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's an ongoing thing, and yes, the media doesn't cover it,
Right.
but we have been working on getting the facts out.
I think that if you think about the land back movement and about indigenous people, because it's both actual land back, but it's also metaphorical, like what we want back. And so in my tribe, the government gave us a grant for land, which we bought land back from the government who took the land from us, which I always think is this crazy irony. But I think that land base, the more land that a tribe can recover of its homelands and not own lands, because indigenous people would own lands, then that's part of a groundswell of a part of reclamation in whatever small piece that can look like, because it is so vast. I mean, the size of and the breadth of the colonization is so huge that I think it's easier for the U.S. to say, well, we can give reparations to African Americans because it's more concrete. But what would reparations for Native people actually look like, right? And it's not about, because reparations for Native people, would that mean like you get all the land back?
They all pack and go home.
They all pack and go home. But how realistic is that? Because half of, like one-third of me might have to go
Except for our
somewhere
friends and
else.
family, of course.
And so the idea of like, what do you do with all these kids who were sent to boarding schools, right? Like, how do you repair that? I think it's a very different, it's just a very different thing, and an answer for it. At least I don't have the answer.
I'm pretty sure there isn't. I mean, so here's another story. You'll find that every question gets a story, right? Barbara Mumby Huerta, please wave at the crowd, and I were part of a group of people who had a statue taken out of Civic Center. And I've got to admit, I was a very small part of that, but I think there were 3 of us we know of that ended up with a death threat around that. And I was one of them. And being that I had so little to do with it, I thought that was a little unjust, but there we are. I think it's because I had come to the attention of the Klan previous to this point. They burned one of my books. And the Tulsa World called me up and said, how does it feel to have your books burned in your homeland? I was like, well, this isn't my homeland. Either by birth or by origin. My homeland's in Georgia. When they're burning them in Georgia, let me know. But you tell him, if they burn 10,000 of them, I'll chip in for the white gas. And, if they're very nice about it, I'll come dig the fire pit. Because I was wondering what that spike in the sales of my book was. Never ran that story. I think my response was unsatisfying. But during the course of the statue removal, I sat next to a guy during one of the hearings at City Hall who was like, "You're dead. You're all dead." Okay. I kind of looked at him and went, "Having a good evening?" And he goes, "I'm going to tear your eyes out." And he kept this up for, that meeting lasted quite a while. I believe there was an hour of it where he was like, talking, but an hour of the meeting, I think he was talking trash at me. And I finally just, this can't go for more than 15 minutes or they're going to have to pay people some serious overtime for leaving the building open. So I tell you what, you give me 10 minutes after this meeting is over for me to use the John, get a little bit of water, and then I'll meet you in the parking garage and we can have a chat about you pulling my eyes out. And he didn't show up. But that is the other part of the thing that we're fighting against, is this, you're all dead. You don't exist. Right? Does it sound like anything else? There are no trans people. That is not a real thing. Right? Whenever somebody's trying to convince you that a group of people doesn't exist, they've got an agenda. It's probably not a good one. They're the Bond villain with the cat that they're stroking. That's who these people are. And so when we start talking about reparations, truth and reconciliation, we're also dragging, now these particular cohort, there's not as many of them as other people, but that is what we're dragging on the end of that anchor chain to get it to the point where we can actually have a real conversation. You've got the government giving the Mont Benai money to buy the land back from the government that the government took, which is an interesting flow chart if you sketch it out.
Let's go over that again. You got the
And
government.
then on the other side of that, you've got Knuckle Dragger wants to tear my eyes out and I'm dead already, right? Or he wants to threaten, because if he'd wanted to do it, he would have shown up in the parking garage and he wasn't there. So I think I was supposed to be intimidated. This is what we're dealing with. And one note about women in Native communities. I was raised by a culture where the person in charge was the person carrying the clipboard with some gaffer tape bracelet around their wrist and probably an apron on. And this is the thing the United States government has never understood. And until actual gender equity hits a certain point, there are a lot of tribal entities like mine who aren't going to be heard in 3 dimensions because the people that we're talking to have no concept of what our culture looks like and cannot fathom it.
I'm a weaver.
Again, let's give ourselves a hand. Just relying us together. And you are all my allies, I can tell. And we all like to sit around the kitchen table and plan visions. So thank you all for coming. If we cut it short by 15, 20 minutes, I don't think anybody's going to blame us. And I want to just say that if you ever get the chance on a Wednesday evening between 6 and 8, except for the first Wednesday of the month, I want you to tune in to KPOO Radio and listen to Voices of the Native Nations. We've been on the air since 1973, and KPOO says there will always be a Native show on this radio station. It's an all-volunteer radio station. We don't accept money from corporations or the government, so it's friends of us who listen to the show, who support the station and keep us on the air. So keep on listening, keep on caring, and you know, we play a lot of music too. We have fun.
There's some good music on that show.
And, you know, we got all kinds of genres. We got native metal, we got native rappers, we got native blues, we got native jazz, we got, I mean, you know, we got...
Holiday classics.
In Cherokee, eh? Are you talking about, are you talking about Santa being trapped in the hole in the teepee?
No.
Oh, okay.